England, 1854. Mabel Oscar never imagined her life would change with the mere stroke of a pen. One moment, she was a humble maid in the grand halls of Vancroft House, blending into the background as the world of the aristocracy danced around her. The next, she was stepping into a world she had never dared to dream of. Married to the Duke of Vancroft, a man whose love would shatter the boundaries of class, reputation, and expectation. But their union was no fairy tale. In a world where the whispers of scandal could topple empires, their love would be tested in ways neither of them could have foreseen. Would their bond survive the judgment of society? Or would their love, as improbable as it seemed, become a beacon of defiance against everything they had ever known? This is the story of a love that defied everything. Before we dive into Mabel and Frank's journey, make sure to subscribe, to like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us share more stories like this, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into the story. The grand chandeliers of Vancroft House shimmered, casting a soft golden glow that spilled over the polished marble floors and the illustrious guests that filled the ballroom. The sound of laughter, hushed conversation, and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the cavernous hall, mingling with the soft strains of the orchestra playing from the balcony above. To the guests, the evening was one of celebration, a night filled with high society and all the splendor that came with it. But to Mabel Oscar, standing quietly in the far corner of the room, it was nothing more than a reminder of the world she could never truly belong to. Mabel's gaze drifted over the crowd, taking in the gowns of silk and satin, the glittering jewels that adorned the necks and wrists of the ladies, the immaculately tailored coats and breeches of the gentlemen. The sights filled her with awe, a longing she could never voice. A lowly maid, she was invisible to most, a servant in the grand household of the Duke of Vancroft. She was content with her station, or at least she had learned to accept it. But there were times like these, when the world seemed so far beyond her reach that the weight of her place in society bore down on her heart. The world she moved in was one of silence and service, unnoticed by the very people whose lives she had become an integral part of. Her attire was modest, a simple white gown, a uniform of sorts. The empire waist design, unadorned with jewels or lace, spoke volumes of her position in the grand hierarchy of Vancroft House. It was beautiful, but there was no sparkle to it, no flourish, only an elegance that belonged to the world of servants. The gown was just plain enough to ensure that she could move through the crowd with little attention, blending into the background, just as she had always done. As Mabel moved through the ballroom, serving the guests, offering trays of delicate finger foods, and refilling glasses of wine, she marveled at the beauty of the room, the perfect picture of aristocratic grandeur. The ladies twirled in their dresses, their laughter filling the air like music. The men conversed in hushed tones, their voices confident and assured, as though they owned the very air they breathed. Mabel, however, kept her distance, knowing her place well. She was the quiet observer, the one who moved behind the scenes, unseen by all but the most discerning eyes. Her eyes, though, were not for the glittering lights or the opulent gowns. They were trained on the Duke of Vancroft's sister, Lady Eugenia, who was the reason Mabel was even here in the first place. Mabel's duty tonight, as on every night, was to attend to Lady Eugenia's every need. The young lady, pale and elegant, stood by the grand fireplace, her blonde hair pulled back in a cascade of curls, the soft fabric of her gown glistening in the firelight. Eugenia, with her aristocratic air and perfectly poised presence, was everything Mabel could never be. The very sight of her filled Mabel with admiration, a quiet yearning for the life she could never have. But it was not Lady Eugenia who caught the eye of the Duke of Vancroft, Frank Willy, that evening. It was Mabel herself. From across the room, Duke Frank watched her, his sharp gaze following the quiet movements of the maid as she navigated the crowd. He had seen her countless times before, flitting about the house in her quiet, graceful way, but never had he truly noticed her until now. There was something in the way she moved, so poised, yet so humble, that caught his attention. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the bustling world of Vancroft House, where everyone fought to be seen, to be noticed. Mabel, however, had no such desire. She was the embodiment of simplicity, and in that simplicity, she possessed a strength that Frank found strangely captivating. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments across the room, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the ballroom faded away. It was a fleeting glance, nothing more, but for Frank, it was enough. The connection, unspoken and subtle, lingered in the air between them, and for the first time that evening, he felt the pull of something he couldn't quite name. His heart quickened slightly, but he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on his duties as the Duke. He had his own responsibilities, his own life to live, and Mabel Oscar was simply a maid. Still, the image of her, her quiet grace, her unassuming beauty, lingered in his mind long after she had turned away to continue her work. Mabel, oblivious to the Duke's gaze, continued her duties. She offered a polite smile to the guests, ensuring they were well attended, her thoughts drifting to her quiet existence in the corners of Vancroft House. She had grown accustomed to being unseen, to existing only in the background of the grand life her Lady Eugenia, led. There was a comfort in that, in the certainty of her place. Mabel was good at her job, and in a way, that was enough. She had no aspirations beyond the duties assigned to her, no dreams of wealth or status. The world she inhabited was one of simplicity, and she had long accepted it. As the evening wore on, Mabel found herself near the refreshments table, carefully arranging more delicate pastries for the guests to enjoy. She didn't notice the Duke approaching, but as he did, his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. She caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye, but her attention remained fixed on her task. The sense of wonder that had once filled her heart, now replaced with the familiar rhythm of duty. It was then that he spoke. "You've been busy all evening," Frank remarked, his voice low, but carrying the subtle warmth of someone who had noticed her work. "And yet, I find it hard to believe you're content in such a role." Mabel looked up, startled by his words. The Duke was standing before her, his tall figure commanding the space around him, his sharp features softened by a rare, genuine smile. For a moment, Mabel forgot how to breathe. She had never expected to be addressed by him, let alone in such a manner. Her voice caught in her throat, but she managed to compose herself. "I am content, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the flutter in her chest. "I serve Lady Eugenia as best I can." Frank's gaze softened, though there was a trace of something else in his eyes, something that Mabel couldn't quite understand. He studied her for a moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. But before he could speak again, a voice called his name from across the room. "I must go," Frank said, his voice suddenly distant. "But you have my thanks, Mabel. Your dedication does not go unnoticed." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mabel standing in stunned silence. His words, though brief, hung in the air like a delicate thread, tying her to the moment she had just experienced. She watched him go, her heart racing inexplicably. But she quickly dismissed the feeling. He was the Duke, a man of power and status. She, a maid. There was no place for someone like her in his world. But as she returned to her duties, there was a small flicker of hope that had begun to stir in her heart, something that had been quiet for so long. It was a simple thing, that flicker, but it was there, and it filled her with a sense of wonder, a feeling that for a moment she might be more than just a servant. The days that followed Lady Eugenia's sudden illness were marked by a quiet flurry of activity at Vancroft House. Mabel Oscar, accustomed to the smooth rhythm of daily chores, found herself now thrust into a more demanding role, one that kept her constantly on her feet. With Lady Eugenia confined to her chambers, Mabel was needed more than ever, not only to carry out her usual duties, but to attend to the lady's personal needs. What was once a simple, almost soothing routine had now transformed into something more urgent and fraught with responsibility. Mabel moved about the house, her pace faster than usual, her hands always occupied with something. Fresh towels for the sick room, hot water for a bath, the soft clink of china as she prepared another round of tea. Every few minutes, she would slip quietly into Lady Eugenia's room, where the doctor was often present, his brow furrowed in concentration. She was never given much time to rest, and yet there was a strange sense of purpose to her days. She had been entrusted with something far beyond her usual station, a role she hadn't expected to fill. Caretaker, confidant, and, in many ways, the only calm presence in the storm of Lady Eugenia's illness. Despite the busy nature of her days, it was hard to ignore the constant presence of Duke Frank Willie in her life now. His usual aloofness had softened, and he seemed to have a newfound concern for his sister's well-being. Frank was often in and out of the sick room, his brow just as furrowed as the doctor's, though there was a quiet vulnerability to him that Mabel had never noticed before. In those moments when he wasn't attending to his sister, his gaze would drift over to Mabel, an unspoken understanding between them that lingered in the air. It was during these moments that Mabel found herself battling an internal conflict she couldn't easily shake. She tried to ignore it at first, the strange flutter in her chest whenever Frank looked at her, the quiet voice in the back of her mind that kept whispering that he saw her as something more than a mere servant. She had seen the way his gaze softened when they exchanged a few words in passing, the brief smiles that passed between them when their eyes met. But the reality of her position, of their divide, kept her grounded in what she knew to be true. He was the Duke, a man of power, wealth, and status. She was a maid, a mere servant. There was no room for someone like her in the world of someone like him. Yet, despite her best efforts to dismiss it, her attraction to Frank deepened. She found herself thinking of him more than was appropriate, imagining fleeting moments where their conversation could stretch beyond the formal pleasantries she was accustomed to offering. She had seen how his calm demeanor hid the weight of the world on his shoulders, how he carried the mantle of leadership with quiet grace. There was a gentleness to him that she had never expected in someone so powerful, a gentleness that made her heart ache with longing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the sprawling grounds of Vancroft House, Mabel found herself once again in the kitchen, preparing another tray of food for Lady Eugenia. The house was quiet, the usual hum of laughter and conversation replaced by the heavy silence that surrounded Lady Eugenia's illness. Mabel felt the weight of it, and as she placed the tray carefully on the table, she glanced out the window, her thoughts drifting. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she turned to find Duke Frank standing in the doorway, his tall frame framed by the dim light from the hallway. He looked tired, his usual poise giving way to a quiet weariness that made him appear more human, more vulnerable than the Duke she had once only observed from a distance. "Mabel," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Eugenia. It means more to her than you realize." Mabel felt a flush rise in her cheeks, and she quickly lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing nervously against the edge of the table. "It is my duty, Your Grace," she replied softly, the words coming out almost automatically. She could hardly look him in the eye, knowing that such a simple exchange felt like it carried so much weight between them. Frank took a step closer, his gaze not leaving hers. "You've done far more than your duty," he said quietly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made Mabel's heart skip a beat. "I can't help but see how much strength you've shown throughout all of this. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I admire it." Mabel felt her breath catch in her throat, the quiet admiration in his voice doing something to her she hadn't expected. He admired her? She, a mere servant, a maid in his household. It was impossible. Yet the way he looked at her, as if she were not just someone who moved in the background, but someone worthy of recognition, it unsettled her. "I am simply doing what is needed," Mabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Eugenia is my responsibility. I only wish to make her as comfortable as possible." Frank's expression softened, and he took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You do far more than that," he said again, his voice growing more earnest. "Your presence brings a calmness to this house that no one else could provide." He hesitated, then added, "I don't know what I would do without you, Mabel." The words hung in the air between them, and Mabel felt a tremor in her chest, a swell of emotion she couldn't quite place. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself believe that his words meant something more than just gratitude. But she couldn't allow herself to entertain such thoughts. He was the Duke, and she was nothing more than a maid. "I'm only doing my duty," she repeated softly, this time with more conviction, trying to force the feelings of warmth that were rising within her back into the confines of her heart. "Nothing more." Frank's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, the silence between them charged with an unspoken understanding that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. He took a step back, breaking the tension, and Mabel felt herself exhale in relief, though her heart still raced in her chest. "I should go," he said softly, as if reluctant to leave. "Thank you, Mabel." She nodded, unsure of what to say, unsure of what was happening between them. Frank turned to leave, but before he could step out of the kitchen, he paused and glanced back at her, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and something else. Something that made Mabel's heart race again. "I hope you know," he said quietly, almost to himself, "that you are far more than just a maid to me." With that, he was gone, leaving Mabel standing in the kitchen, her pulse still racing, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. His words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of them. What did they mean? Was it possible that he felt something for her, too? But no, she was a maid. She had no place in his world. Still, the words lingered. They haunted her in the quiet moments when she was alone, when the house settled into darkness and the weight of the day bore down on her. It was foolish to think that a man like Frank, a duke, could ever see her as more than a servant. Yet in her heart, she couldn't help but wonder, could it be that he truly saw her? Could it be that he was beginning to see her not for her status, but for the person she truly was? Mabel shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. She was a maid. She would always be a maid. There was no room for hope in a life so clearly defined by duty. Yet, deep down, A small seed of possibility began to take root. And though she tried to dismiss it, it grew with each passing day, each passing glance from Duke Frank Willie. The days following Lady Eugenia's diagnosis were marked by an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on the entire household. The once grand halls of Vancroft House, filled with the sound of music, laughter, and guests, now seemed to echo with an eerie quiet. The ballroom, where just days ago the most esteemed members of London society had gathered in celebration, now stood empty and untouched, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. For Mabel Oscar, the weight of her new responsibilities was both a burden and an opportunity. No longer just a maid to Lady Eugenia, she had become the lady's primary caretaker, assisting with her medical needs, tending to her comfort, and ensuring that the household continued to function despite the looming shadow of illness. The suddenness of the situation left little time for adjustment, and Mabel found herself moving quickly through her new role, her mind focused solely on the tasks at hand. She moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, her movements swift and purposeful, her thoughts constantly occupied by the well-being of the woman who had once been her employer, but was now a fragile figure in need of constant care. In the mornings, Mabel would wake early, her first task to prepare a fresh pot of tea for Lady Eugenia, and then she would assist with the administering of medicine, adjusting the bed linens, and offering comfort in whatever form she could. She would spend hours by the lady's side, reading to her, listening to her complaints, and keeping the house in order as best she could. There was little time for rest, and Mabel welcomed the distraction. In the quiet moments when Lady Eugenia slept, Mabel allowed herself to reflect on the sudden shift in her life. Only days ago, she had been the quiet maid in the background, but now she was thrust into the heart of the household, managing things no one had ever expected her to. Despite the chaos of her new role, Mabel couldn't help but feel the eyes of Duke Frank Willie on her more often than not. His presence was unavoidable. As his sister's condition worsened, Frank found himself spending more time at the estate, his once distant demeanor replaced by one of quiet concern. He had always been a man of few words, but in those moments when he was with Mabel, there was an unspoken connection between them that could no longer be ignored. His gaze followed her, not with the cold, commanding authority of his usual manner, but with something else, something warmer. Mabel felt it whenever their paths crossed, the subtle way his eyes lingered on her, the soft tone of his voice when he addressed her. It was a shift she hadn't expected, and though it made her heart flutter, it also filled her with a deep sense of unease. Mabel couldn't allow herself to entertain such thoughts. She was a maid, nothing more, nothing less. Her place was in the background, her value defined by her duty, not by any romantic notions she might dare to imagine. Frank was the Duke, wealthy, powerful, and destined to marry someone of his own stature, someone with the social standing to match his own. His gaze on her, no matter how gentle, could never mean anything beyond simple gratitude for her efforts. She was, after all, nothing more than a servant. Yet every time Frank's eyes met hers, a flutter of something stirred in Mabel's chest. It was impossible to ignore. When he thanked her for her help with Lady Eugenia, his words were not just words of politeness, they were sincere. There was admiration in his voice, a deep respect that Mabel had never anticipated receiving from someone like him. She couldn't make sense of it, but she couldn't deny the way it made her feel. Important, seen, valued in a way she had never been before. One afternoon, as Mabel sat beside Lady Eugenia, carefully combing the lady's hair in the dimly lit room, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching the door. The door creaked open, and Frank stepped inside. His presence filled the room, an aura of quiet authority that had always seemed to define him. But today, there was something different in his posture, a weariness that made him appear less like the Duke he was, and more like a man on the edge of something he couldn't control. "Mabel," he said, his voice low and gentle, his gaze moving from his sister to the maid at her side. "How is she?" Mabel glanced at Lady Eugenia, who was sleeping fitfully. Her face was pale, the fever still lingering, though she had grown quieter in recent hours. "She's resting," Mabel said softly, her fingers still working through the tangles in Lady Eugenia's hair. "She's still weak, but I believe the fever is starting to break." Frank nodded, his face drawn with concern, though his eyes never left Mabel's. "Thank you," he said, his tone filled with an almost imperceptible note of gratitude. "For everything. I don't know what we would do without you." The words, so simple yet filled with meaning, made Mabel pause. She lowered the comb for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "It is my duty, Your Grace," she said, almost automatically. But the words sounded hollow to her ears. Her duty. She had said them countless times before, but today they felt different. Today they felt like a shield she used to keep herself at arm's length from the emotions that threatened to overtake her. Frank's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, and Mabel could feel the weight of his stare. There was something in his eyes, something more than gratitude, something that made her heart skip. But she quickly averted her gaze, afraid that if she looked too long, she might see something in his expression that would confirm her deepest fears. That somehow he had begun to see her differently, and that, she was certain, would only lead to heartbreak. As the days wore on, Mabel continued to attend to Lady Eugenia with the same dedication she always had, but there was an added tension now, an awareness that Frank was no longer just the Duke who paid her no mind. He was something else now, someone whose presence made her heart race and her thoughts scatter. Every time their paths crossed, Mabel found herself struggling to keep her composure. Her once steady confidence was now shaken by the complexity of her feelings. The knowledge that her heart had somehow become tangled in a web of emotions she couldn't untangle. One evening, after dinner, Mabel found herself alone in the hall, preparing a tray for Lady Eugenia. The night was quiet, and for a moment, Mabel allowed herself to pause and take a breath, the weight of the day finally beginning to settle on her shoulders. But as she turned to continue her task, she found Frank standing at the top of the stairs, watching her. "Mabel," he said, his voice carrying down the hall, though his tone was less formal than usual. There was a softness to it now, something she hadn't expected to hear from a man like him. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, turning to face him, her heart unexpectedly quickening at the sight of him. He descended the stairs slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. "I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can express enough how much I appreciate everything you're doing for Eugenia. You've given me peace of mind during a time when I feel helpless. You're the one constant in this house right now." The sincerity in his voice made Mabel's heart swell, and she fought to keep her composure. "I'm only doing what is required of me," she said, her voice wavering slightly, despite her best efforts to sound unaffected. Frank stopped a few feet away, his gaze now intense. "It's more than just duty, Mabel. You're more than just a maid." The words, spoken so directly, made her pulse quicken, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She wanted to protest, to remind him of her place, but she found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, all she could do was look at him, her mind racing with confusion and longing. Frank seemed to sense her struggle. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know this may seem impossible," he said softly, his voice low but firm. "But I want you to know that I see you. And I don't know what that means yet, but I think it's something more than I've ever seen in anyone before." Mabel's heart thudded in her chest, and she swallowed hard. She couldn't let herself believe what he was suggesting, could she? The idea that he, this powerful, noble man, might see her as something more than just a servant was a fantasy she couldn't afford to indulge. Her place was here, in the shadows, caring for the ones who mattered. But as she stood there, caught between her duty and her growing feelings, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to her story than she had ever imagined. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Frank took another step forward, his gaze soft but steady, and Mabel felt herself falling into the quiet depths of his eyes, unable to look away. "I don't expect anything from you, Mabel," he said softly, "but I wanted you to know that you matter, more than you think." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mabel standing in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a place for her in his world. The days that followed Lady Eugenia's slight improvement were filled with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Vancroft House. It was the kind of tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud, pressing down on the staff and the family alike. Whispers began to trickle through the corridors, carried on the winds of gossip and speculation. It was a scandal, a royal scandal, the kind of event that threatened to destabilize not only the family, but the very fabric of the aristocracy itself. The Duke of Vancroft's name had somehow become entangled in the affairs of the court, his family linked to rumors of political intrigue that had reached the ears of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. Details were vague, but the mere hint of impropriety was enough to send shockwaves through London. Newspapers carried headlines that spoke of betrayal, of secrets, and of political maneuvering that could cost the Duke not only his title, but his place among the high society of the realm. As the scandal unfolded, the once grand halls of Vancroft House became quieter, more somber. The usual elegance and grandeur of the estate seemed to dim under the weight of the scandal. Frank was no longer the composed Duke he had once appeared to be. His posture, which had always been upright and commanding, now seemed slightly hunched, weighed down by the invisible burden of the family's troubles. He spent long hours in his study, attending to letters and correspondence, trying to navigate the public turmoil with as much grace as he could muster. But Mabel could see the toll it was taking on him. His usual distance had turned into something more akin to isolation, as though he was retreating into himself, away from the world, and, for the first time, away from her. Mabel, for her part, found herself caught in a whirlwind of activity. Her role in the household had always been confined to the background, attending to Lady Eugenia, serving the family, and ensuring that the house ran smoothly. But with the scandal rocking Vancroft House, Mabel was thrust into a more prominent position. She was asked to manage tasks that were well beyond her usual duties, ensuring the household continued to function amidst the turmoil. The staff looked to her for direction, and she gave it, moving with determination through the halls of the house, making decisions that were not hers to make, but which she had no choice but to carry out. Every time she crossed paths with Frank during this time, the weight of their unspoken connection became more apparent. In the past, their interactions had been brief, polite, and formal. But now, with the world in chaos, they found themselves sharing more moments where words were spoken with a new sense of urgency, a new sense of intimacy. Frank would seek her out for brief conversations, asking her opinion on matters concerning the household, or simply making casual remarks to ease the tension in the air. Mabel's heart would race in those moments, unsure of how to respond, yet unable to avoid the pull she felt toward him. Her feelings for Frank had deepened in the past few weeks, and the scandal, though terrifying, also seemed to bring them closer in ways she had never imagined. One evening, after the sun had set and the shadows began to lengthen in the corridors of Vancroft House, Frank found Mabel standing alone in the grand drawing room, staring out the large windows at the sprawling estate. The world outside was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos within. He approached her quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "Mabel," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "How is Lady Eugenia this evening?" Mabel turned to face him, her heart fluttering in her chest at the sound of his voice. It had become a familiar comfort, yet now it also carried an undertone of something else, something she couldn't quite define. "She's resting," Mabel replied, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions within her. "The fever has subsided, and she seems stronger." Frank nodded, though there was no relief in his eyes. His expression was tired, etched with lines of worry and uncertainty. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, though his words seemed distant. "I've been worried about her, and about everything else." Mabel hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should speak the words that were on the tip of her tongue, but the silence between them seemed to demand it, and she found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "You've been under a great deal of pressure," Mabel said softly. "The scandal, your family, it's a lot to bear." Frank's eyes flickered to her, and for a moment, there was something vulnerable in his gaze, something he hadn't allowed himself to show before. "It's more than just the scandal," he said, his voice quiet, his tone heavier than before. "It's the weight of everything. My family, the expectations, the fear that I'll fail. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." Mabel's heart ached for him, the rawness of his confession stirring something deep within her. She took a tentative step forward, her hands clasped together in front of her, unsure of what to say. But before she could speak, Frank took a step closer, his voice growing softer. "I've never been good at letting people in, Mabel," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "But I can't deny that I've come to rely on you, more than I ever thought possible." Mabel's breath caught in her throat. His words, spoken so softly, carried an intimacy that both thrilled and terrified her. She had always known her place in the grand scheme of things. She was a maid, a servant. And yet, here was Frank, the Duke, admitting that he relied on her. It was a dangerous thing, she realized, the growing bond between them, a bond that threatened to shatter everything she had worked so hard to maintain, her role, her place, the quiet life she had always known. "I'm here to help," Mabel said, her voice steady but strained. "You don't have to bear this alone, Frank." His eyes softened, a flash of something like gratitude crossing his face. But there was also something more, a longing, an unspoken connection that neither of them had dared to address until now. Frank's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The noise of the world, the scandal, the pressures, the expectations, faded away, leaving only the two of them in that quiet space, suspended in a fragile moment of understanding. "I don't know what I would do without you, Mabel," Frank said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "You've become more than just a maid to me. I admire you." The words hung in the air, and Mabel felt her heart race. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply stood there, the tension between them palpable. She had never imagined that Frank could see her in any way beyond her role as a servant. And yet, here he was, speaking words that contradicted everything she had ever believed about her place in the world. "I don't belong in your world, Frank," Mabel said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just a maid, a servant." "I can't—" "Mabel," Frank interrupted, stepping closer to her, his voice firm yet gentle. "You are so much more than that. I've never seen anyone with the strength, the grace, the heart that you have." Mabel's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, the way they shifted the air around them, changing everything. She wanted to believe him, but her fear, the fear of what this connection might mean for both of them, held her back. "Frank, this can't be," Mabel whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're a duke. I'm just a maid. What would people think? What would happen to us?" Frank's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening with an intensity that Mabel had never seen before. "I don't care about what people think, Mabel. Not anymore." His words were laced with a fierce determination. "I care about you. And I think I've always cared about you, more than I've been willing to admit." Mabel's heart raced as she looked at him, his words filling her with a sense of dread and hope all at once. She had never imagined that Frank could feel anything for her beyond gratitude. And yet, here he was, admitting feelings that both thrilled and terrified her. "We can't," Mabel said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's too dangerous. If anyone found out—" Frank stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "Mabel, I don't care about the danger. I care about you." The words, so simple and so raw, settled in Mabel's heart, leaving her breathless. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do with the emotions that swirled inside her. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the impossible, the idea that she, a maid, might be loved by someone like Frank Willy, a duke. But the thought brought with it a sense of fear, of uncertainty, of a future that could not be jumped. The scandal that loomed over them could destroy them both. As Frank's hand rested gently over hers, Mabel felt the weight of the world shift. She had always known where she stood in the grand scheme of things. But now, in this moment, standing so close to Frank, she felt like everything she had ever known was about to change. "I don't know what the future holds, Frank," she said softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "But I know that this connection can't be. Not like this." Frank didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. "We'll figure it out, Mabel. Together." And for the first time, Mabel allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the impossible could become real. The night had fallen heavier than usual, the house quiet except for the faint sound of the wind rustling against the windows and the distant murmur of the house settling into its nightly routine. Mabel Oscar had just finished tending to Lady Eugenia for the umpteenth time that evening. The tasks were endless, but they were familiar, a comforting rhythm that helped dull the disquiet she often felt as the days stretched on. Lady Eugenia had drifted into a fitful sleep, the fever finally beginning to subside after days of tending to her, and Mabel had stepped away from the sick room, her feet dragging from exhaustion, but her mind still racing. It had been a long day, an exhausting week, really. She could hardly remember the last time she had felt truly rested, as the demands of her new role as caretaker left little room for sleep. But even as fatigue settled in her limbs, there was something else gnawing at her, the feeling that she was on the precipice of something she couldn't control, something she had been avoiding. She had always known her place in the world. She was a maid, no more, no less, and that was all she had ever been. But Frank Willy, the Duke of Vancroft, had shattered the walls of that understanding, leaving her unsure of what to do with the feelings that had begun to take root in her heart. She had convinced herself that it was simply gratitude, a fleeting attraction that came with the intensity of the situation, but deep down, she knew that it was something more. And every time Frank looked at her, his gaze lingering a moment too long, her heart threatened to betray her. Mabel had hoped that with the passing days, the distance between them would be restored. Her role as the maid, his as the Duke, and nothing more. But the scandal that had consumed the household had forced them closer, and now she found herself standing on a precipice, unable to turn back. As she passed through the hallway toward her quarters, she heard the faintest sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, only to find Frank approaching, his tall frame bathed in the soft glow of the candlelight from the nearby sconces. He looked as weary as she felt, his shoulders slightly slumped, and his brow furrowed in a way that made him appear almost human, vulnerable in a way that Mabel had never seen before. "Mabel," he called, his voice low but strong. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Her heart skipped, a nervous flutter rising in her chest. It wasn't unusual for Frank to ask her to join him for a moment. He had done so before, for the sake of family matters, or to discuss Lady Eugenia's condition. But tonight, there was a difference in his tone. There was an urgency in his voice, something deeper that made Mabel hesitate before answering. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied softly, her voice betraying none of the apprehension she felt. She turned to face him fully, her hand subconsciously smoothing the fabric of her gown as she tried to calm her racing heart. Frank closed the distance between them, his gaze never leaving her face. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but the words seemed to escape him. Instead, he simply gestured to the small sitting area near the window, inviting her to sit with him. She followed his lead, sitting carefully on the edge of the armchair, trying to avoid looking at him too directly, afraid of the emotions that might surface if she did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with something unspoken, something that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. Mabel's thoughts were spinning, her mind racing with all the ways in which this conversation might go wrong. She was a maid. She had no right to be sitting here, in this room, with Frank. They had no future beyond the roles they had been born into. And yet, here they were, caught in a moment that felt like a fragile line between propriety and something far more dangerous. Finally, it was Frank who broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mabel," he began, his tone low and strained. "I've been meaning to say this for a while, but I'm not sure how to make sense of it." Mabel looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he had approached her. There was a vulnerability in his expression that made her breath catch. He was no longer the composed Duke she had always known, but a man torn by something he couldn't quite articulate. "What is it, Your Grace?" Mabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile connection between them. Frank hesitated, his jaw clenching as he gathered his thoughts. Then, as if making a decision, he spoke again, this time with more conviction. "Mabel, I can't keep pretending that this is just a simple matter of duty. I know you're here to help Lady Eugenia, and I know that this is the role you've played in my household, but—" He paused, shaking his head, as though trying to understand the words he was saying. "But it's more than that. I see you, Mabel. I see you for who you really are, and it's impossible for me to ignore it any longer." Mabel's heart lurched in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. She felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs, her thoughts swirling in a haze as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to remain calm. "What do you mean?" Frank met her gaze, his eyes dark and intense, filled with a mixture of emotions that she couldn't quite name. "Mabel," he said, his voice barely audible. "I've tried to deny it. I've tried to pretend that what I feel for you is nothing more than gratitude. But it's more than that. Much more." Mabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Your Grace, I don't understand." Her words were soft, uncertain, as though she were speaking to herself more than to him. Frank sighed deeply, his hand running through his hair in a gesture of frustration. He stood for a moment, as if weighing the enormity of the confession he was about to make. When he spoke again, his voice was firm, filled with a raw honesty that left Mabel feeling exposed in a way she had never experienced. "I'm drawn to you, Mabel," he confessed, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "In ways I can't explain. You have a strength in you, a grace that no one else possesses. You've become more to me than just the maid of the house. He stopped himself, taking a deep breath, as if bracing for the impact of his words. "I care for you, more than I ever thought possible." Mabel felt her world tilt on its axis, as Frank's confession hung in the air between them. It was impossible. She was just a maid, nothing more. Frank was the Duke, a man who had never even considered someone like her as anything other than a servant. And yet, here he was, admitting feelings that defied everything she had ever known. She felt a surge of panic rise in her chest, her heart pounding in her ears as she struggled to find her voice. "Frank," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be. You're the Duke. I'm just a maid. What would people think? What would happen to us?" Frank's face softened, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I don't care about what people think," he said softly, his voice calm but unwavering. "I care about you. I've never been able to shake the feeling that you're someone special, someone who deserves more than the life she's been given." Mabel shook her head, unable to make sense of what he was saying. "You can't mean this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm just a maid, Frank. I don't belong in your world. You deserve someone of your own stature, someone who can stand by your side without shame." Frank moved closer to her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Mabel," he said gently, "it doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is who you are, and who you are is everything to me." For a moment, Mabel stood frozen, her heart a cacophony of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself believe that they could have a future, that they could somehow overcome the divide between them. But fear held her back, the fear of scandal, of ruining both their lives. "I don't know how to reconcile this, Frank," she whispered, her voice thick with uncertainty. "I don't know how to be anything but what I've always been." Frank's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. "We'll figure it out, Mabel. Together." The words, simple and full of promise, left Mabel with a sense of helplessness and hope all at once. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with Frank's hand in hers and his confession still echoing in her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if, perhaps, they could figure it out together. The days that followed Lady Eugenia's decline were marked by an ever-present sense of urgency. Vancroft House, once bustling with guests and laughter, had become a hollow shell, its halls now echoing with the soft murmur of staff moving quietly in and out, attending to the needs of the ailing lady. The weight of the house's somber mood hung heavily in the air, and the usual order of things had become a distant memory. Mabel moved through each day with a quiet grace, performing her duties with the same dedication she always had, but with a growing sense of exhaustion that gnawed at her. She had been a servant in the house for years, but never had she been so closely entwined in its fragile fabric, balancing the demands of Lady Eugenia's care with the increasing pressure surrounding Frank's family. The scandal that had plagued them continued to simmer, threatening to erupt with each passing day. Frank, still reeling from the public disgrace, was more distant than ever, his eyes often distant and filled with an intensity that made Mabel's heart ache. Despite his withdrawal, there were moments when their paths would cross, quiet, private exchanges, where Frank would look at her with a softness that spoke volumes, a look that left her breathless. These fleeting encounters only made Mabel's internal conflict grow stronger. Her feelings for him were undeniable, but her place in his world, her humble role in the household, made her feel like an outsider. She couldn't allow herself to entertain the notion of anything more than what they already had, a bond formed in the midst of crisis, bound by gratitude and necessity. But when Frank began spending even more time in the house, attending to his family's affairs, something in the air shifted. There was a tension in the way he moved about the house now, a restlessness that only seemed to increase with each passing day. It was as if the weight of the world, his title, his family's legacy, the looming scandal, was too much for him to bear alone. Mabel felt this weight in her bones too. Her heart had never been further from the quiet, predictable life she had once known, and yet the prospect of a future beyond her station was both exhilarating and terrifying. There were times when the pull of Frank's presence made her forget everything, her place, her position in the world, and she could almost imagine what it would be like to step out of the shadows and into the light. But those moments were always fleeting, replaced by the harsh reality that a maid could never be with a duke, no matter how much her heart yearned for it. It was on one of these nights, after another long day of tending to Lady Eugenia, that everything changed. Mabel had been in the sitting room, gathering her thoughts after the evening's duties, when Frank appeared at the door. His face was more drawn than usual, his shoulders heavy with an invisible burden. He had been spending less time at his desk lately, his mind seemingly preoccupied with his sister's illness and the mounting pressure from his family. "Mabel," he said, his voice hoarse, as though the words had been caught in his throat. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Mabel looked up, startled. She had become accustomed to their brief exchanges, but tonight felt different. She nodded quickly, though her pulse quickened at the sound of his voice. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest as she set aside the book she had been reading. Frank stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind him, his eyes searching hers, as though he were trying to find the right words. His gaze was filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before, and Mabel suddenly felt the weight of the moment. She had never seen him like this, so raw, so vulnerable. "Mabel," Frank began, his voice a whisper now, "I've spent the last few days thinking about everything, about Eugenia, about the family, about us." The way he said "us" made Mabel's heart skip, and she felt a sudden knot form in her throat. The thought of him thinking about her, about what they might be, felt impossible. Yet there was no denying the weight of his words. I've tried to keep my emotions in check, to focus on the responsibilities that come with being a duke, Frank continued, his voice filled with frustration. But I can't anymore. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel for you, Mabel. Mabel felt a sudden rush of emotion overwhelm her. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. You know my place. I'm just a maid, Your Grace. I don't belong in your world. Frank stepped closer, his hand reaching out as if to steady himself, his eyes locking with hers. Mabel, you don't understand. It's not about your status or your role. It's about you, who you are. You have a strength, a kindness that I've never found in anyone else. I've never seen anyone care for my sister the way you have. Never seen anyone carry themselves with such dignity and grace, even when the world seems to be falling apart around them. Mabel shook her head, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. Frank, please, she whispered. This isn't right. I'm not meant for you. I'm nothing but a servant in this house, and you are. He cut her off, his voice more insistent now. No, Mabel, you're so much more than that. I've never looked at you as just a maid. I've seen you, seen who you truly are, and it's impossible for me to ignore it any longer. The sincerity in his eyes left Mabel breathless, and for a moment she could find no words to respond. What could she say? How could she reconcile her feelings for him with the life she had always known? The life that had always kept her in the shadows, never allowing her to dream of anything more than what she was. But Frank was looking at her now, and his eyes held an emotion she could not deny, an emotion that was far too real for her to dismiss. I don't want to live in this world of responsibilities and obligations anymore, Mabel, he said softly, stepping closer. I don't want to marry someone just for the sake of appearances, just to fulfill my family's expectations. I want to marry you. If you'll have me. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. His words, spoken with such raw emotion, seemed impossible. She could hardly breathe, her heart racing as the gravity of the moment crashed down on her. But Mabel began, her voice breaking. I'm not. You're everything I need, Mabel, Frank said, his voice steady now, though there was a tremor in his hands. I've realized that, and I can't wait any longer. Will you marry me? Will you be mine? Despite everything, despite what people might say, despite the scandal. The world around her seemed to fade as she looked into his eyes filled with vulnerability, with hope, and with a sincerity that made her heart ache. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a declaration of something more, something she had never thought possible. A life with Frank Willy, a duke, was a world she couldn't even imagine. But in his eyes, she saw something else. A man who was willing to defy everything he had been taught for the sake of love. For the first time in her life, Mabel realized that fear couldn't be the thing that held her back. She couldn't live in the shadows forever, couldn't let her own doubts and insecurities keep her from stepping into a world beyond her wildest dreams. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. Frank's face broke into a smile, and in that moment, Mabel knew her life had changed forever. No longer would she be a maid, hidden away in the corners of Vancroft House. She was stepping into a new world, one of love, responsibility, and the defiance of every rule she had ever known. It was terrifying, yes, but as Frank reached out to take her hand, the weight of the decision seemed to disappear. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would build a future no one had ever imagined. The whispers began almost immediately. At first, it was just a murmur, a quiet ripple of disbelief that spread through the halls of Vancroft House. But as the news of Duke Frank Willie's marriage to Mabel Oscar, the very maid who had served Lady Eugenia for years, reached the wider world, the scandal grew. London society, with its rigid divisions of class and status, was not known for its tolerance, and the union between a noble duke and his servant was beyond comprehension for most. The whispers turned to gossip, the gossip into scandal, and soon it seemed that no one could speak of anything else. It had been a quiet ceremony, a private affair held in the family chapel at Vancroft House, away from the prying eyes of society. Only a select few were invited, the closest of friends and family who had known Frank and Mabel's journey. It was a small but poignant ceremony, marked by an air of intimacy and love. Yet even in the sanctity of the chapel, where the vows were exchanged in a moment of pure emotion, the weight of what was to come hung in the air like an undeniable cloud. Frank and Mabel had no illusions about the consequences of their marriage. They knew what it would mean. The aristocracy would never accept it. As the newlyweds emerged from the chapel, their hands clasped tightly together, a chorus of hushed gasps followed them. Mabel, still in her simple white gown, felt the weight of every eye upon her as she stepped into the light of a new life. She was no longer just Mabel the maid. She was the Duchess of Vancroft. But the title, once a dream she'd never dared to imagine, now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. The first days after the wedding were fraught with tension. Vancroft House, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage, the walls closing in on Mabel as she adjusted to her new life. It was as if the house, too, had been changed by the scandal that had rocked it, the grand hallways now echoing with the invisible weight of judgment. Frank, ever the composed duke, tried to shield her from the worst of the criticism, but Mabel could feel the eyes of the staff and the few remaining friends of the family, watching her with curiosity, judgment, and, she feared, disdain. The first public event they attended as a married couple was a small gathering at a neighboring estate. Frank had insisted that they attend, if only to show that their marriage was no mere whim, that it was real, and that they would face the world together, no matter the consequences. Mabel, however, had not been prepared for the barrage of cold stares and whispered remarks that greeted them as they entered the ballroom. She had always been aware of her place, of the divide between the servants and the aristocracy. But this felt different. Now, as Frank's wife, she was thrust into a world that had always looked down upon people like her. "Mabel, don't let them see you falter," Frank whispered to her, his arm tightly around her waist as they walked through the room. His voice was low, steady, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes that she had never seen before. "We have nothing to prove to anyone." Mabel nodded, but it was hard to ignore the whispers that followed them like shadows. She could feel the eyes of the ladies in the room, their stares colder than the marble floors beneath her feet. The men, some with their backs turned, others with raised eyebrows, were equally dismissive. A lady in a pink gown sneered as Mabel passed by. "Did you hear?" she said to a friend, loud enough for Mabel to hear. "The Duke of Vancroft has married his maid. It's outrageous!" Mabel's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, clinging to Frank's arm as they made their way further into the room. Frank, to his credit, kept his gaze forward, his face impassive, though Mabel knew the toll the situation was taking on him. He had fought against the world for her, against his family, against the expectations of his peers. And still, the world refused to see them as equals. Still, the world viewed them as a scandal, a curiosity, a mistake to be whispered about behind closed doors. Frank led her to a quiet corner, away from the prying eyes of the guests. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them weary from the weight of the evening. "Mabel," Frank said finally, his voice low, "I know this isn't easy. I know the world is cruel, but we will face it together. Don't let their whispers cloud your mind. You are my wife, my equal, and that is all that matters." Mabel looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion, but doubt lingered in the back of her mind. "I want to believe that, Frank," she said softly, her fingers trembling in his hand. "But they don't see me as your equal. They see me as your mistake." Frank shook his head, a small, almost sad smile tugging at his lips. "Then let them see us as a mistake. Let them talk. We have something they will never understand. Our love is ours, and no one can take that from us." Mabel wanted to believe him, to believe that their love could withstand the judgment of society. But it was hard, harder than she had anticipated, to walk through the world with such open eyes, knowing how cruel the world could be. She had never thought herself worthy of Frank before, and now, with the weight of the scandal upon them, she felt even more undeserving of him. Days turned into weeks, and the gossip surrounding their marriage only intensified. In the streets, they were talked about in hushed tones, the scandal becoming the topic of every social gathering, every whispered conversation. Some of the more conservative families shunned Frank and Mabel altogether, refusing to even acknowledge their presence at events. There were invitations that never came, friendships that withered under the weight of public opinion. Mabel felt the sting of those absences acutely, the weight of her new position as a Duchess, not only defined by her marriage to Frank, but by the rejection she faced at every turn. But despite it all, Frank remained unwavering in his support. Every night when they returned to Vancroft House, he was there, his arms around her, his quiet strength a balm for her wounded heart. In those moments when it was just the two of them, Mabel found solace. She knew they had no easy path ahead, but in Frank's embrace, she found the courage to face the world once more. One evening, after an especially trying social event where the whispers had been louder than usual, Mabel found herself standing in the garden, looking out over the carefully manicured lawns. The air was cool, the stars bright above her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, clearing her mind of the negativity that had threatened to suffocate her. "Mabel?" She turned at the sound of Frank's voice, seeing him approach with the same quiet determination that had been with him from the very beginning. He stopped just behind her, his presence a steady force that calmed her nerves. "Mabel," Frank said, his voice soft but full of conviction. "I see you, and I see everything you are. Don't let them convince you that you are anything less than what you are. A strong, beautiful, dignified woman. You have more courage than all of them put together." Tears welled in Mabel's eyes as she looked up at him, overwhelmed by the love in his gaze. "It's hard, Frank," she whispered. "It's so hard to face them, to feel like we're being torn apart by their judgment." Frank stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I know," he said, "but together we are stronger than any of them. I will always stand by you, no matter what they say. We've already defied the odds." "What's a few more whispers?" Mabel's heart swelled with gratitude and love. In Frank's eyes, she no longer saw a duke, nor a man bound by societal rules. She saw a partner, someone who truly understood her, who saw her for who she was. No titles, no scandals, just the love they shared. And in that moment, Mabel realized that her worth was not tied to her title, her status, or the judgments of others. Her worth was in who she was, her strength, her heart, her love for Frank, and that was enough. The whispers of the world would never define her again. She had found a love that would withstand the storm. Together, they would face the world, no matter the judgment it cast upon them. "Together," she whispered, her voice filled with certainty. Frank smiled, and they stood side by side in the cool night, ready to face whatever the future held, together, as equals, as partners, and as a family. Mabel sat in the quiet of her new study, the sunlight filtering through the curtains and casting soft patterns across the room. It had been months since her marriage to Frank, and the initial shock of their union had slowly worn off. The whispers that had once followed them like an unrelenting shadow had started to fade, and in their place, the two of them had found a quiet rhythm in their new life. Her role as Duchess was still new, and though she had been hesitant at first, Mabel had begun to embrace it with a quiet determination. There was so much she didn't know, so much to learn about the expectations placed on her now. But with Frank by her side, she had slowly grown more confident, realizing that her place at his side was not a mere formality. She was his equal in every sense, something that had once felt impossible. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as she had begun to settle into her responsibilities, that Mabel made the discovery that would change everything. She had come across an old collection of letters, hidden in a drawer of the desk in Frank's study. She had been tidying up when the yellowed edges of the papers caught her eye. Intrigued, she carefully pulled them from the drawer, unsure of what she would find. The handwriting was familiar, but it wasn't until she began to read that the true weight of their contents became clear. The letters were a series of correspondences between Frank's father, the previous Duke of Vancroft, and several prominent political figures of the time. The nature of the letters was concerning: political alliances forged in secrecy, backroom deals, and promises made in exchange for power. It was clear that the Duke had not always operated within the boundaries of honor and transparency. Mabel's stomach turned as she read through the pages, each one revealing more about the Vancroft family's involvement in schemes that had cost them dearly. The most shocking revelation, however, was one of betrayal, of a family member, someone who had been close to Frank's father, being sold out for political gain. The names mentioned in the letters were now long forgotten by most of society, but the scars they had left behind were still evident. It was no wonder that Frank had always seemed distant, his struggles with his family's legacy more complicated than she had ever realized. Mabel closed the letters, her hands shaking slightly. She had always known there was more to Frank's reluctance to embrace his position, but she had never imagined the depth of the conflict that lay beneath the surface. The Vancroft family, with all its wealth and power, was built on a foundation of secrets and compromises, and Frank had spent his life carrying that weight. No wonder he had resisted marriage, resisted the idea of a partnership that would require him to take on the mantle of his family's name. His resistance had never been about Mabel, not truly. It was about his own fear of becoming something he had always despised. As she set the letters back into the drawer, Mabel felt a deep sense of sympathy for Frank. The man she had married, the Duke who had defied everything to be with her, was a man haunted by the choices of his past. The weight of those decisions, the burden of his family's legacy, had shaped him in ways she had never fully understood. But as much as Mabel wanted to understand, she also knew that this was not a world she could ever truly belong to. She was now the Duchess of Vancroft, but she was still an outsider in so many ways. The very people who had once whispered about her marriage, who had scorned her as a maid, now saw her as a figurehead, a symbol of the family's scandal. She was a woman of humble beginnings, thrust into a world of politics and power that she could barely comprehend. It wasn't just Frank's past that Mabel had to contend with. It was her own role in this new life. She had been thrust into the responsibilities of being a duchess without ever having asked for them. She had always been content in her position as a maid, knowing her place, performing her duties without question. But now, the responsibilities of managing the estate, overseeing the staff, and attending to the needs of the community were all hers. It was overwhelming, and at times, Mabel felt like she was drowning in the weight of it all. She had often confided in Frank, her worries about the challenges of her new position, her fear that she wasn't worthy of it. But Frank had always reassured her, his quiet strength a grounding force that kept her from losing herself in doubt. "You were always more than a maid, Mabel," he would say, his voice firm with belief. "You are the Duchess now, and you will learn to stand in that role with the same dignity and strength that you've always shown." But as the days passed and the demands of her new life mounted, Mabel found herself questioning whether she could ever truly live up to the legacy of the Vancroft family. Her role as Frank's wife had once seemed like a dream, a fantasy she had never dared to imagine. But now, with the weight of the title pressing down on her, she found herself struggling to find her place. One evening, as she sat in the study once more, Frank entered the room, his brow furrowed with worry. He had spent the day meeting with his advisors, navigating the delicate political situation that had arisen from the family's past mistakes. Mabel could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the burden of leadership wearing heavily on him. "Mabel," he began, his voice soft but filled with something like apology. "I know I've been distant lately. I've been preoccupied with everything. The estate, the family, the scandal. I didn't want to burden you with any of it." Mabel stood and crossed the room to him, her heart aching as she saw the weight in his eyes. "Frank, you don't need to apologize. I understand. I know what you've been carrying all these years." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you, Mabel. But I know it hasn't been easy. Your role in all of this, it's not one you ever asked for." Mabel shook her head, her fingers brushing against his hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I didn't ask for it, but it's mine now, and I will do whatever I can to help, to support you in any way I can." Frank stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "You've already done more than I could ever expect. You've shown me what it means to truly live with integrity, with honesty. You've taught me more than anyone ever has." Mabel's heart swelled with emotion, but the weight of the revelations from the letters hung heavy in her mind. "Frank, I've been reading your father's letters," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I know about the things he did, the deals he made." Frank's expression hardened, and he looked away for a moment, his jaw clenched. "I wish I could say I didn't know, but I've lived with the consequences of those actions my whole life. It's why I've been so reluctant to embrace this role, to take on the title of Duke. I didn't want to be like him, Mabel. I didn't want to be defined by the choices he made." Mabel stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not him, Frank. You've made your own choices. And you've chosen to be something better. You've chosen love over duty, compassion over power. And that is something no one can take from you." Frank looked at her then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had rarely seen. "I've spent so much of my life trying to avoid the mistakes of my family, Mabel. But now, I see that I can't escape my past. All I can do is move forward, and I can only do that with you by my side." Mabel's heart swelled with love for him, but also with a deeper understanding. The man she had married was not just a duke. He was a man who had been shaped by the very system that had tried to tear him apart. He had chosen her, someone with no title, no pedigree, as his partner. And together, they would face the future, no matter what secrets from the past might come to light. "You're not alone, Frank," Mabel said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "We'll face it together. We've already defied the odds, and I will stand by you. Always." And in that moment, as the weight of the family's past hung heavy in the air, Mabel realized that her role as Duchess was no longer just about titles or expectations. It was about standing by Frank, about supporting him as they faced the challenges ahead, no matter how insurmountable they seemed. And in doing so, she found her place in the Vancroft family, not as an outsider, but as an equal. Together, they would rewrite the future of Vancroft House. Together, they would build something new. The sun had barely risen over Vancroft House, casting a soft glow across the estate. Mabel stood at the window of her private study, gazing out over the sprawling grounds that had once seemed so distant and unattainable. The gardens, which had been a place of quiet retreat when she had first arrived, now felt like a reflection of the life she had built. In the years since her marriage to Frank, it had been months since they had wed, and in that time, she had come to accept a role she had once believed was beyond her reach. The title of Duchess had come with a weight she had not expected. The expectations, the responsibilities, the constant scrutiny of society, it had been overwhelming at times. But in the quiet moments when she was alone with Frank, she had begun to see the truth of what she had gained. She was no longer just Mabel, the maid who had served Lady Eugenia. She was Mabel, the Duchess of Vancroft, and she had earned that title not by birth or status, but by the strength of her character, the love she shared with Frank, and the sacrifices they had made together. As Mabel stood there, looking out at the gardens where she had once wandered in solitude, she realized how much she had changed. She had once felt like an outsider, a woman defined only by her station, by her past. But now, with the responsibilities of her title pressing on her shoulders, she understood that her worth was not bound by her past. It was bound by the person she had become. The world had changed, and so had she. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned, surprised to find Frank standing in the doorway, his dark eyes studying her with the same intensity she had come to expect. His presence was a constant source of comfort, and yet today, something felt different, more significant, somehow. "May I join you?" Frank asked, his voice warm, but filled with an underlying tension. Mabel smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. He moved toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone serious, "about how far we've come, about everything we've faced together." Mabel nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window once more. "It's hard to believe sometimes," she said softly. "I never imagined I'd be standing here, looking out at Vancroft House as its Duchess. It still feels unreal." Frank stepped closer, his hand gently brushing her arm as he leaned in to speak. "It may feel unreal, but you've earned it, Mabel. You've earned every bit of it. You've shown me what it means to be strong, to be kind, to lead with grace. You're not just my wife. You're my equal. You always have been." His words, simple yet filled with conviction, settled over Mabel like a comforting cloak. She felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, pride, and a deep, abiding love for the man who had stood by her side through every trial, every challenge. He had never once seen her as less than worthy. He had always believed in her, even when she had doubted herself. "I've struggled," she admitted quietly, "to believe that I deserve this life, that I deserve to be here, as your partner, as your Duchess. I've spent so many years feeling like an outsider, like I didn't belong in this world. And now, even though I've stepped into this role, I sometimes wonder if I'm truly ready for all that it entails." Frank's expression softened, and he reached out to gently lift her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're ready, Mabel. You've always been ready. This role is not about your title. It's about who you are, your strength, your character, your heart. That's what makes you the Duchess. Not your station, not your name, but the person you've become. And I couldn't be prouder to have you by my side." Mabel felt a swell of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Her heart beat faster, and she fought to steady herself as Frank's words settled deep within her. He had given her the confidence to see herself not as the maid she had once been, but as the woman she had become, strong, capable, and deserving of the life she now led. "I'm not sure I can ever fully understand how we got here," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know this. Together, we've faced the impossible. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. I'll stand by your side, just as you've always stood by mine." Frank smiled, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "That's all I've ever wanted, Mabel. You and me, facing the world together. We've built something beautiful, something no one can take from us." Mabel took a deep breath, her gaze shifting toward the horizon, where the sun had begun to set, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the life she had built with Frank, a life that had been forged in love and trust, in the quiet moments they had shared, and the challenges they had faced side by side. "I never imagined this for myself," Mabel said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "I never imagined that I could be more than just a servant, that I could be a part of something so powerful. But I've realized that my worth is not defined by my past. It's defined by what I've become, by the love we share, and by the strength I've found within myself." Frank stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, offering the kind of support and reassurance that had become a cornerstone of their relationship. "Your worth has never been defined by your past, Mabel," he said softly. "You've always been more than anyone gave you credit for, and now the world will see that. They'll see you for the woman you are, not the title you hold." Mabel turned to face him, her heart full as she gazed up at him. In his eyes, she saw not just a duke, but a man who loved her unconditionally, who saw her as his equal in every sense. The weight of his words, the truth in his gaze, was enough to push aside the lingering doubts that had held her back for so long. "I'm ready," Mabel whispered, her voice steady with newfound certainty. "I'm ready to step into this role, to face whatever comes next, with you by my side." Frank smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. "I knew you were ready, Mabel. I always knew." The world outside, once so daunting and filled with expectations, no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a canvas, one they would paint together, with every color of their love, their trust, and their strength. They had built a life together, one that transcended titles and expectations, one that was grounded in the love they had for each other. With Frank's support, Mabel knew she could face whatever challenges came their way. She was no longer defined by her past, nor by the expectations of society. She was the Duchess of Vancroft, yes, But more than that, she was Frank's equal, his partner, and his love. And together, they would carve out a future that belonged to them alone. In the days that followed, Mabel embraced her new role with grace and confidence. She took on the responsibilities of managing the estate, attending to the needs of the staff, and fulfilling her duties as Duchess with the same quiet strength that had always defined her. And as she did, she realized that the power she had been seeking was not in the title itself, but in the love and trust she shared with Frank. They were no longer bound by their pasts, but by the future they were creating together. The world would continue to judge them, to question their union, but it no longer mattered. They had each other, and that was enough. And so, as Mabel stood beside Frank, her hand firmly clasped in his, she knew that their journey was just beginning. They had faced the impossible, and now, together they would face whatever the future held, united in love, strength, and an unbreakable bond. No longer defined by their stations, but by their hearts. Their future was theirs to shape, and nothing could stand in their way. Thank you for following Mabel and Frank's journey through love, growth, and the courage to defy societal expectations. If their story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who may need a reminder that love, strength, and true partnership can transcend any boundary. For more stories of love, transformation, and the power of believing in each other, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support means the world and keeps these tales alive. Stay tuned for more unforgettable adventures. Our next one is just around the corner. 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 Just around the corner.